Okay, so this is the second of my videos summarizing some concepts to do with software development that you need to know about for this project, which you may or may not have encountered before. So in this case, we're going to be covering Scrum. So, what is Scrum? So first of all, I should say, if you haven't watched the video on story cards, you should watch that video first, because there I cover some introduction to Agile software development as well. So watch that one first. So Scrum is an agile development framework for managing complex software development in an incremental manner as an agile development process. Effectively, it is a structure that defines how a software development team or teams should organize what they are to do into a series of iterations, which they call sprints. So the core principles of Scrum are as follows. So first of all development is defined in terms of the functions or functionality that the system is to provide from a user perspective in the form of product stories or user stories, which we've written down somehow. User stories at the beginning of the project are not expected to be complete, so there will be missing user stories and potentially new stories can be added later. Development is going to be iterative, and effectively you will be tackling a subset of the functionality during each iteration, where these iterations are known as sprints using Scrum terminology. So yeah, a Scrum will tackle a subset of user stories, and user stories may end up spanning multiple sprints if they cannot be completed within a single sprint, either because they're large or because they just overrun beyond the length of a single sprint. At the end of each sprint, progress is reviewed by the team and management as a whole to see how well things progressed, as well as to identify directions for improvement. Within a particular sprint, teams should be meeting regularly. Scrum itself recommends every day. However, for the team project that you're currently working on, you're probably only going to meet every couple of days, or maybe every 3 days, depending upon how easy it is for you to get together. And one of these regular meetings is called a scrum. I guess coming from the idea of rugby or American football is probably where that's coming from. That's where Scrum gets its name. And new stories may be added to the project over time, which is added to effectively a backlog of stories that you need to complete before the project as a whole is marked as done. So if we kind of think about this in diagrammatic form, what happens is we have some kind of initial project vision, which describes, okay, what are we going to do? For that, we're going to then generate a series of user stories. And in your case, these user stories are going to be defined as user story cards, which I described in the previous video. Once you have those story cards, you're then going to plan a particular sprint. So you're going to decide, okay, what story cards are going to go into an individual sprint. So this is kind of sprint planning, right? So effectively, a sprint has a predefined length, and you can say, okay, right, I think during the sprint we can deal with maybe 40 whatever items you have, whatever your cost metric is for your story cards. And so based on that, you can then say, okay, I'm going to put in these particular stories to add up to that amount of number, where I'm going to prioritize the highest priority stories first. So you define what stories are going to go into your sprint. Then you have your team members start working on those sprints. And so effectively you will work for a period of time, maybe a day, maybe multiple days, and then you will have a scrum meeting to check on progress and see, okay, well, what stories have been completed? How far along are they? Are you encountering problems or blockers that need to be dealt with? So you can track within a sprint how well progress is being made. Once the time period for the sprint is over, so maybe 2 weeks have passed, or a week and a half has passed, or potentially longer, whatever the defined endpoint for the sprint is, you then have a sprint review and retrospective. And this is all about looking back on the sprint and saying, okay, what did we accomplish? And then what can we do to improve for the future or to reorganize for the future? So the core concepts you need to understand for a sprint are, first of all, the project backlog. So this is just the full list of stories that you need to complete for the project to be complete. And this backlog can be dynamic. So new things can be added to it and things can be removed from it if they are no longer deemed to be required. You then have a sprint. So this is a defined period of time where development is going to happen, and a sprint will have a particular set of stories associated to it. Sprints are usually between 2 and 4 weeks long. Each sprint will have its own backlog. So this is the set of stories that have been assigned to that sprint. And a team of engineers and developers will be assigned to a sprint. Right? So you will have different teams. In your case, you have one team, which is going to be working on stories. In a larger development environment, you might have multiple teams. Each team will have frequent meetings, which are called scrums. So in your case, maybe that's every 2-3 days. And this is to decide to sort of cover what has been done, what needs to be done next, and also what blockers did you encounter and how might you overcome those blockers. At the end of a sprint, you have a sprint review where you look at the different stories that were completed, and you have a sprint retrospective which looks at issues encountered and how you might improve. In terms of specialist roles for Scrum, there are 2 main roles you need to be aware of and that you should have someone assigned inside your group. So you should have a project owner, and so these are responsible for, this person is responsible for maintaining the project backlog. So effectively the listing of all of the different user stories or story cards that you need to have. This is also the person who writes those story cards. So basically, you can collaboratively decide what those story cards are going to be, but the project owner is the person who is responsible for those cards and writes those cards. They're also the person that assigns the priorities on those cards and then effectively orders the story cards based on those priorities, so you know what's going to go into the sprints, at least at the start. Because you're going to have regular meetings within your team, in your scrums, you need to have a scrum master. So this is the person who's responsible for setting up the meetings. They're responsible for chairing those meetings, so basically making sure that people turn up and that the actual meeting is productive, and they are to facilitate problem solving within the team. Last thing we need to cover is what happens during the reviews. So you will have 2 reviews during the course of your project because you have 2 sprints, so there should be a review for each one. So effectively these are to evaluate how well things went and what can we do to improve. So during the sprint review, what you do is, first of all, the project owner is going to cover or describe what was completed. The team will then discuss what was successful, what issues were encountered during the time period, and also how those were solved, if they were solved. The current product at that level is then demonstrated. So maybe it's partial product, maybe you've completed something that you can show. Once the product has been demonstrated, the project owner then goes back to the overall project backlog and says, okay, here are the things that are still outstanding that need to be completed, and then the stories for the next sprint are going to be assigned at that point. So that's the sprint review. You then have the sprint retrospective, which usually happens around about the same time as the review. It might be part of the same meeting, where this is looking at kind of higher level things that you might improve in terms of your organization, looking at kind of more strategic changes to your organization to improve effectiveness or efficiency. So things might be here, you're going to reassign team roles because someone is more effective at particular things you've discovered. Maybe you've changed your priorities, and so you need to maybe change the priorities on the story cards, or maybe new stories have been added, or you've discovered a story is not needed, so you remove it. These kind of things would happen during the sprint retrospective. And so that's all you really need to know about scrums. So effectively, during your project, you're going to need to assign a project owner, and you're going to need to assign a scrum master for your scrums, and then you're going to have 2 scrum sprints. So for each sprint, or for the first sprint, you're going to need to decide, okay, what stories from your story cards are going to go into that sprint to be tackled, and then you're going to need to have regular meetings to track, okay, the progress of those. At the end of each sprint, you're going to do a sprint review and retrospective, and you'll need to describe that inside your report, so the outcomes of those meetings, or those reviews. And then you're just going to do that a second time. So during the second sprint, you're going to assign some more stories, hopefully the remainder of your stories, to that sprint if you only have two, so that you can then hopefully complete all of the functionalities. I should say at the end of each sprint review, one of the things that you will do is you will draw a burn down chart. So what this does is this tracks the completion of the different stories during your sprints, right? So effectively, this is just a line graph which shows, okay, at this point, we have completed 21 of the 40 units that I have inside my story, right? So effectively, you can see, okay, right, this is roughly how long or how quickly I'm completing my different stories, and you can compare that against your expected trend. That way, you can see if you're ahead of schedule or behind schedule. And that's it. That's all you need to know for scrums. You're going to be doing 2 of those inside your project.